everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is May the 16th, 2024. I'm Barry Stagner. Thank you for joining us this evening. Looking forward to our time together. And if I was going to put a label on our program this evening, I would have to call it the escalation. We're seeing things like the birth pain progression that Jesus talked about, increase in frequency and intensity. And I have to say, there are significant things for us to examine this week in our stories that tell us that things are heating up. Now, we've talked about this in the past, that, as things relate to prophecy, they kind of have an ebb and flow, and they escalate for a while and then seem to stagnate for a bit and then escalate again. But I think that it's quite possible we are in the final escalation before the rapture of the church and the tribulation that follows. And a few things that we'll talk about here tonight. But one of the things that's happening right now that's kind of interesting, and we mentioned this a bit last week, is there's a lot of debate that is heating up online on social media platforms between Catholics and Mormons and Christians, and lots of attacks on Protestants. And I've seen multiple things. I saw somebody this past week say that if you're not drinking wine, real wine during communion, you're sinning. I mean, this is how far these things have gone. And, I think this person obviously is very ill informed. And I think if you would take a look at the word wine in the Greek or Hebrew, it's the word for grape juice. And it doesn't, of course, grape juice would be applicable to wine and fermented grapes. But, just the debate is getting intense. So I think it's important that we know what it is we believe and stand strongly upon the word of God, and not be driven about by every wind of doctrine and getting pushed around by some of the things that there's some people out there that are quite well known that are saying things that are actually just flat out wrong. They're contrary to scripture. So we need to know the word of God. And I hope you're in a Bible teaching church. I know that's becoming harder and harder to find in these last days. And by the way, I think I mentioned last week that there was a roundtable with Jan Markell, Pastor Michael Lee, Amir, and myself scheduled for this weekend for Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And that's been changed. The date is now Tuesday, May 21st, a date I well know. That's my beautiful wife's birthday and my little sister's birthday too. And but 10 a.m. Pacific time, Jan, Michael A., Amir, and myself will be discussing the rise of anti-Semitism happening today, specifically in the church. So I hope you can join on the Behold Israel platforms, YouTube and Facebook. And I'm not sure if it's going to be streamed to my YouTube or not, but it's coming out of the Connect studios that are now, or actually as of today, I think the final equipment installations took place from all the technological elements that are necessary for it to be operational. But again, Amir's in Israel. Much of the people that are working for him are Jews, and not Messianic Jews, but Jews. And therefore, Saturday is Shabbat, and they will not be working. So the event is going to be, or the online event is going to be held on Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific Daylight Savings Time. And hope you can join us. And if not, it'll be archived and you can watch it after the fact. But this is a very pressing issue. And again, this is one of the things that is on the rise. This is one of the things that is increasing just incredibly rapidly in these last days, this rise of anti-Semitism. We're seeing a significant escalation in that. Well, on to our stories for this evening. And the first comes from the Times of Israel. And the headline reads, Israel marks 76th Independence Day at war with hearts full of sorrow and pain. And here we are now on day 224 of the hostages that have been taken and the war that's broken out in Israel. And Israel, the article says, marked a subdued 76th Independence Day on Tuesday with muted celebrations and hearts full of sorrow and pain in light of the war with Hamas in Gaza, with the losses of the past months and the plight of the hostages foremost in national events. More than 7 months after Hamas' October 7th massacre in southern Israel, the day saw ongoing conflict in Gaza, rocket fire on southern Israel, and attacks across the northern border by Hezbollah. Previous Independence Days have seen hundreds of thousands of Israelis flock to parks and beaches for barbecues and picnics with friends and family, but this year, most were largely empty. U.S. President Joe Biden sent a letter to President Isaac Herzog congratulating him on Israel independence and wishing for a more peaceful year ahead as Israel marked the holiday. In his letter to Herzog, Biden noted that as the first country to have recognized Israel's independence in 1948, the U.S. is proud of its enduring relationship with Israel. Our bonds are underpinned by sharing democratic values, common interests, and cultural affinities, Biden wrote, amid strained ties in recent weeks, which have come about in part due to the U.S. opposition to a full scale IDF offensive in Rafah, where Israel says 4 of Hamas' remaining 6 battalions are located. This past year has been deeply painful as Israel suffered the worst attack in its history since October 7th, 2023. Biden continued acknowledging the somber mood that has underpinned Israel's 76th Independence Day, the first since the October 7th massacre, when Hamas terrorists slaughtered 1,200 people and abducted 252, 128 of whom are still held in Gaza. But the people of Israel have shown tremendous strength and resilience. And the president reiterated that he is a lifelong supporter of Israel and that the United States' commitment to Israel's security, is ironclad. He went on to say, finally, I look forward to our nations continuing to work together to forge a brighter future for all people. And I hope that the coming year brings more peace and joy than suffering. And in the midst of all this, and I think we certainly understand the kind of the general temperature of the population there in Israel and what a ongoing, continuously grievous and fearful thing is happening within that very small country, some 8,800 square miles. But the other thing I think we need to recognize is that in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus mentioned a generation that will not pass away. And this is pictured by a budding fig tree. Now, there are those who say the fig tree has no meaning in relation to the nation of Israel, but that kind of flies in the face of Jeremiah chapter 8 that talks about Israel being a fruitless fig tree. Also, we have Joel 1:7 and Hosea 9:10, both the Lord calling Israel my fig tree. So there's an Old Testament precedent for Israel being national Israel, that is, being represented by the fig tree. And Jesus said, when the branch is tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. And of course, he's making this illustration of something that they would all be aware of. Figs were abundant in that area and are. And he's saying, you recognize this as a sign. And he says, when you see the fig tree budding again, representative of Israel, know that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And this is one of the reasons I believe that we are nearing the end of the labor portion, at least I don't want to call it light labor. I don't think any woman would agree with that statement. But the beginning portion of labor and moving toward the heavy labor elements where things happen intensely and frequently, as we see with the 3 sets of judgments during the tribulation, which complete God's wrath on a Christ-rejecting world and the discipline of Israel, leading to them looking upon the one whom they pierced and mourning for him as one mourns for an only son. Now, I don't want to speculate as to how long a generation is because nobody knows. Some like to point to the Psalms, and the man's years will be 70, or by reason of strength, 80 years. And I don't want to force that into any kind of relationship with the fig tree and the age of Israel. But one thing we do know is that Israel is 76, and that's a lot closer to the end of the generation that saw the rebirth of the nation than it is to the beginning. So I think at any moment we should be looking for that and listening for the sound of the trumpet, the voice of an archangel, the dead in Christ rising first, and we who are alive and remain meeting them in the air. Now, it's interesting, as I mentioned at the top of the program, there's a lot of traffic going on out there, a lot of comments being made, a lot of finger pointing happening in the church right now, a lot of division between like Reformed folks and evangelical Christians. And, there's a prominent pastor who said, there's no mention of the rapture in the book of Revelation. And, I think that's just ignoring the fact that there's a phrase repeated over and over and over that marks transitions, and it's the Greek phrase metatauta. It means after these things. And Revelation 4, verse 1 says, after these things. What things? After the things of the seven churches. After the church age, John was told, come up here. And that actually the only word that is in the Greek text is the word translated as up, and it means to take up or to be taken up. So John, a member of the church, is taken up into the heavenly scene, and then interestingly, the church disappears from the narrative and doesn't reappear again until Revelation 19 when we return with Jesus. Now, we're told that in Revelation 19, especially 11 to 16, about the return of Christ, and there are those who are on white horses with him, saints that are with him. And this group is identified in Revelation 19:8, where we're told that the fine linen that they're wearing in 19:11 to 16 is the righteous acts of the saints. This is the church. This is us coming back, having already sat at the bema seat of Christ, been judged for our works, and now we're returning with the Lord to rule and reign with him on the earth as he sits on David's throne and rules the earth the way it should have been run for 1,000 years, with we at his side, ruling and reigning with him. So again, I think with this whole fig tree thing and Israel becoming now 76 years old, I think we ought to be urgent in our compassion for the lost and our desire to see people get saved. Now, the Times of Israel is reporting that Hamas Haniyeh says post-war plans for Gaza that exclude the terror group will be rejected. Well, if you're not part of it, then you got nothing to reject there, Mr. Haniyeh. And Hamas Qatar-based chief Ismail Haniyeh says in a statement that any post-war plan for Gaza that excludes Hamas will be rejected by the terror group. In the same statement, Haniyeh blames Israel for the current deadlock in negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage release deal, saying that by demanding the terror group amend its proposal, it has led the talks into a stalemate. Earlier this month, Hamas claimed to have accepted a truce agreement with Israel, though it later emerged that the proposal it said had come from the Egyptian and Qatari mediators included several elements fundamentally different from what Israel had agreed to. And Jerusalem swiftly rejected the proposal for falling short of its vital demands, but okayed dispatching a working level delegation to the indirect talks in Cairo. Days later, however, Hamas said talks had ended after Israel rejected the proposal submitted by the mediators and raised objections to it. The terror group said it had decided to stick to the terms of the proposal it had agreed to, rejecting the possibility of making any concessions. And Haniyeh reiterates the group's demand that a ceasefire agreement should end the war in the Gaza Strip, which Israel has said it will not agree to until it achieves its goals, which include destroying Hamas's military and governance capabilities. And again, this issue is dividing the world as we see so many just ridiculously ignorant things happening on college campuses around the world. I've watched some students, I forget what university it was, but at their graduation ceremony, they tore up their degrees. And, I believe the piece of paper inside is just something that represents the degree. But symbolically, they were tearing them up and saying free Palestine and all this other nonsense from the stage. And one of the comments made was, mom and dad pay 180 grand for you to graduate from college, and this is what you do to say thanks. It's just an unbelievably ridiculous series of activities we are watching unfold today. But that's to be expected. Strong delusion is going to be part of the last days scenario, reaching its zenith during the tribulation, where many will believe the lie that the Antichrist is the answer to the world's problems, of the beast, first beast of Revelation chapter 13. Now, Breitbart, remember our first article and the things that Biden said to Netanyahu, or I'm sorry, Herzog, regarding the 76th anniversary of Israel's rebirth as a nation. Breitbart says Biden backs internal revolt in Netanyahu government over post-war Gaza. President Joe Biden is backing an internal revolt within Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government over the fate of post-war Gaza after Defense Minister Yoav Gallant publicly declared his opposition to long-term Israeli rule there. Gallant made an unexpected televised address in which he stated that he was opposed to Israeli military rule or civilian rule in Gaza after Hamas and preferred rule by non-terrorist Palestinians with help from Arab states. Gallant said the end of the military campaign must come together with political action the day after Hamas will only be achieved with Palestinian entities taking control of Gaza, accompanied by international actors, establishing a governing alternative to Hamas rule. This, above all, is an interest of the state of Israel. And unfortunately, this issue was not raised for debate, and worse, an alternative was not raised in its replacement. And I must reiterate, he went on to say, I will not agree to the establishment of Israeli military rule in Gaza. Israel must not establish civilian rule in Gaza. Now, interestingly, this past week on one of the founders of Hamas, his son was on a program, if you're not familiar with it here in the States, called Dr. Phil. And he was speaking with two Americans of Palestinian descent. And the son of a Hamas founder said that there is no difference between the Palestinian people and Hamas. The majority of the Palestinian people support Hamas. And this is well documented, and it's not just hyperbole, and it's not, rhetoric, and it's certainly not political hype. It's a fact. And, we've seen footage when 2001 happened on September 11th and American lives were lost. Palestinians were celebrating in the street. They see us as the great Satan like Iran and Israel as the little Satan like Iran. And that's not to say, categorically all Palestinians support Hamas, but the vast majority of Palestinians agree with the hatred of Israel and want to see from the river to the sea Palestine being free, which again is just a call for the extermination of all Jews and the driving out of the Jews from their national homeland. Now, in response to much of what Biden has been doing, Newsmax reports that Netanyahu says Israel is not a vassal state of the United States. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this week pushed back against President Joe Biden's warnings that an attack on the city of Rafah would be crossing a, quote, red line, end quote, for the United States. Israel and the U.S. are currently at odds over how to approach the city of Rafah. Now, remember, 4 of the 6 battalions of Hamas are in Rafah. And if your goal is the destruction of Hamas, and the U.S. has said, multiple members of the administration have said that this is a goal that has to be accomplished, and yet, talking out of both sides of their mouth, which is somewhat the old forked tongue thing that we have become accustomed to, sadly, in these last days. And now they're trying to handcuff the Jews or Israel from finishing the job. And Israel and the U.S. are currently at odds, as I read a moment ago, about Rafah and southern Gaza, where an estimated 1 million Palestinians have taken shelter. Netanyahu said that Israel must enter Rafah, while Biden has described this as the red line, as I mentioned. Netanyahu told his security cabinet that Israel is not a vassal state of the United States in a heated exchange last week, according to Axios. Netanyahu reportedly compared his situation with Biden to that of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, when he declared that Israel's independence, despite the protest of the Secretary of State at the time, George Marshall. He also recounted his speech to Congress that the prime minister made in 2015, in which he proclaimed his opposition to the nuclear deal with Iran, reached by then President Barack Obama, a statement that upset some Democrats and might have affected U.S.-Israel relations. One aide, who was not named, told Axios that Netanyahu said to his cabinet, when it comes to threats to our security, we will do whatever it takes. And obviously, I think we need to be concerned about this. We're going to talk about this on Tuesday with the rise of anti-Semitism, specifically in the church. But I think we always need to keep in mind Genesis 12:3, where Abraham is told that all the nations of the earth through you are going to be blessed. This is a messianic prophecy. Now, that's still happening. All the nations of the earth are still blessed by the one who came from the loin, so to speak, of Abraham and Isaac through Jacob, not the line of Ishmael, but through Jacob. The Bible's very clear that the son of the bondwoman will not be the one through whom the Messiah comes, but he'll come through the son of the free, the one born in the manner that God had prophesied to Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai, as their names were before the Lord changed them. Now, we need to recognize that these things that are happening, are prophetic in nature, and we are watching something that generations before us had no opportunity to view or even understand fully. We're not, speculating as to, well, how are, this whole Ezekiel 37 thing, how's that going to happen? How are the bones and sinew and flesh and breath and all that, how's that going to take place? We've seen it take place, and what was once prophecy to a degree is now history. Israel is a nation again, and we're watching Zechariah 12:3 be fulfilled. And what we need to remember about that Genesis 12:3 prophecy is the Lord said, I will curse those. And the first word, curse, means to do just that, to put a curse on you. I will curse those the one who curses you. Now, the word curse in Genesis 12:3 and the word curses in Genesis 12:3 are two different words. And the second word doesn't mean to put a curse on you, but it means to despise or think little of. So the Lord says, I will curse those who think little of Israel. So we need to be very, very careful about this. And there's no other way to look at that. And those who like to argue, all this stuff was brought to an end when the church replaced Israel. And in the church, there's neither Jew nor Greek. And that's right, that's in the church. But it also says there's neither male nor female. And yet the Bible gives instructions specifically to women. And, looking at Titus and elsewhere, where women are instructed as a group. So if the men and women, male or female, in the church, there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, and yet the Bible addresses women, then why does that mean that there's no Israel? Why does this statement in Galatians is so popular amongst the anti-Semites? Why does that break down when male and female are also clearly identified in Scripture as distinct from one another? And in the church, all the church is comprised of born-again believers. And that doesn't exclude there being a national Israel. And again, these arguments are just arguments of ignorance and disrespect and disregard for the Word of God. So be very, very careful about thinking little of Israel or despising them, because there are negative things that come with having done that. And the Washington Times says, the European Union says Israel's actions in Rafah threaten future relations with them. The EU said Wednesday, and again, this is part of the escalation. Things are moving in a direction, and the rhetoric and the comments are now getting more and more aggressive, and direct threats are now being made. And the EU said Wednesday that Israel's military operations inside Rafah would put its relations with the Jewish state under a, quote, heavy strain, end quote. In a statement, EU officials urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to immediately end the campaign in the city located on the southern edge of the Gaza Strip. EU officials said they recognize that Israel has a right to defend itself after October 7th, when Hamas launched the rampage that resulted in the numbers that we talked about earlier. But any military response must be done in line with international humanitarian law, the EU said. And the operation is further disrupting the distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza, which is leading to more internal displacement, exposure to famine, and human suffering, EU officials said. More than 1 million civilians are sheltering in and around Rafah and have been told to evacuate to areas that, according to the UN, cannot be considered safe. It's funny that all of these things don't mention what's happening in northern Israel with the bombardments that continue coming from Hezbollah in Lebanon and how many displaced Israelis there are. Nobody wants to bring that up. And again, this is the international community's blindness. An Israeli official said 4 of Hamas' remaining 6 battalions are located inside Rafah, along with much of the Palestinian terror group's leadership and possibly many hostages. But they have faced growing pressure from the Biden administration to abandon a full scale operation into the city. And EU officials called on Israel to allow and facilitate unimpeded passage of human relief for civilians in Gaza. They also condemned the street attack, a recent attack rather, by Hamas on the Karim Shalom border crossing, which had obstructed the delivery of humanitarian relief. We call on all parties to redouble their efforts to achieve an immediate ceasefire and the unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas, the EU said. Now, remember, the EU is within the boundaries of the former Roman Empire, from which the Antichrist, the beast of Revelation 13, is going to rise up. So, this turn, these threats, and the growing anti Semitism in European countries is clearly an escalation, so to speak, moving and pushing us toward that moment of twinkling of an eye that has to happen, is necessary to happen before the Antichrist can rise to power. The Times of Israel reports that Hezbollah drone hits Lower Galilee in terror group's deepest strike of the war. An explosive-laden drone launched by the Hezbollah terror group from Lebanon struck an area in the Lower Galilee on Wednesday evening, according to the military. Hezbollah, in a statement, claimed to have targeted a military base near the Golani Junction, west of Tiberias, some 35 kilometers or 21 miles from the Lebanese border, with several explosive-laden drones. It would mark Hezbollah's deepest strike in Israel amid the war. Hezbollah has launched thousands of drones, missiles, and rockets in northern Israel in the past 7 months, though the attacks have largely been limited to the border area. Until Wednesday, the terror group had fired projectiles at Israeli targets up to around 9 miles from the frontier. And the IDF said there were no injuries in the attack Wednesday evening, and it did not immediately provide details on the potential damage. In its statement, the terror group, Hezbollah, claimed to have hit an Israeli Air Force base from which a giant missile-detecting blimp known as Skydu is operated. And this massive blimp, containing an advanced radar system that Israel plans to deploy into the sky over northern Israel to detect incoming missiles and drones, is shown in a picture in the article. And amid the incident, this drone infiltration sounded alarms in the Jordan River Village, a recreational village in the Lower Galilee, close to the Skydu base where the blimp is housed. Hezbollah said the drone attack was in response to recent Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon that killed members of the terror group. And on Tuesday night, a top field commander, Hussein Ibrahim Maki, was killed in an IDF drone strike, prompting Hezbollah to carry out several major attacks on northern Israel, including the drone attack mentioned above. Now, once again, we see another escalation. This drone attack reaching deeper into Israel, south from the northern border with Lebanon than any of the previous attacks. And there are just multiple things that are happening, I think, that make our word for the night, the word for today. Things are escalating. Now, that doesn't mean that things can't calm down or die down a bit. But again, I think we're at the final stages. I really do. I believe we're going to see things continue to ramp up and move in the direction where the Lord, as he said in Zechariah 14, is going to fight as he fights in the day of battle against all nations who fought against Israel. That day is coming. And by the way, the Lord wins every battle he engages in. And, I like to put it just in understandable terms. The Lord has never had a tie. He's never even had a close call. He wins decisively in every battle he engages in, and he will do so on behalf of Israel during the tribulation as well. And I believe we are moving toward that time frame where the Lord is going to fight as he fights in the day of battle and go from defending Israel to the offensive against those who hate Israel. Breitbart says we are facing an inflation inferno. Switching gears a little bit, by the way. Producer Price Index shows pricing rose much more than expected. Sorry about that. A key gauge of inflation surged by much more than expected in April, confirming that the pace of inflation has accelerated. The Producer Price Index for final demand, which measures the prices paid to U.S. businesses for their goods and services, rose by, listen to this, 2.2% in April. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but let's keep reading. The Department of Labor said on Thursday, compared with a year ago, the index is up 2.2%, the largest increase in a year. Now, here's the point. The economists had forecast a 0.3% gain in April compared with March and a 2.2% gain year over year. And the impact of the higher than expected figures for April was somewhat softened because the prior month's estimate was revised down from a 0.2% to a decrease rather of 0.1%. So a percentage point off of the gain, 2.1. The so-called core producer price index, a measure that excludes prices of food and energy, jumped 0.5% or 0.5% in April after calling the 0.1% in March. Economists had forecast a 0.2% gain. Over the year, core producer prices are up 2.4%. And another measure that also excludes wholesale and retail merchant margins, known as trade services prices, rose 0.4% in April compared with a year ago. This core, as the article says, measure is up 3.1%. Now, there's a reason for this, and let me add a couple of other articles, and we'll talk about why this is prophetically important, or potentially prophetically important. Reuters says Argentina cuts rates again as inflation, listen to this, crests 300%. Inflation is over 300%. Argentina's central bank cut the benchmark interest rate on Tuesday after inflation slowed for the fourth straight month, and the annual rate crested just shy of 300% amid a tough austerity drive by Libertarian President Javier Milei. The central bank said in a statement it had cut the overnight rate from 40% to 40% from 50%. The fifth major cut since brash economist Milei took office in December when the central bank changed the benchmark instrument. The move came after the embattled South American country posted a monthly consumer price rise of 8.8%, which is sky high, but down for the fourth straight month since a peak of over 25% in December. Could you imagine prices rising 25% in a single year? You know, I read an article this morning about projected closures of stores and restaurants, restaurant chains around the country, and some of them are just unbelievably huge, where some stores are going to close all 600 of their locations, others are going to close hundreds, and restaurant chains are dropping many of their stores, and much of this is because of the legalized crime in many states, like in California, where you can't be arrested if you go into a store and steal less than $900 worth of merchandise. But, you know, you add to that our previous story and the rise of prices and the indexes that monitor just consumer goods and all the other things we've been talking about. This is all going somewhere. And our next story, I think, is important for us to add. And it comes out of Pakistan. And the article is authored by Reuters. And it says protesters in Pakistan held Kashmir in rallies that killed 4 after authorities revoke price hikes. Protesters in the Pakistan-held part of Kashmir called off rallies over price hikes that have left 4 people dead, and authorities agreed to lower prices of electricity and wheat, pretty important staples of life. The local Civil Rights Alliance, the Awami Action Committee, said it had called off a planned march in the city of Muzaffarabad, the capital of the Pakistani-held part of the disputed Himalayan region, after the government accepted all of its demands. The protest against price hikes erupted last Friday and quickly turned violent. 4 people, including a police officer, were killed in clashes between demonstrators and security forces who used tear gas and opened fire. More than 100 policemen were injured, authorities said. And late on Monday, the head of the local government, Chaudhry Anwarul Hague, said he had reduced prices of wheat and electricity. The economic crisis in the Pakistani-held Kashmir reflects the broader troubles in the country. Pakistan's monthly inflation rate hit 40% last year, much like Argentina, and remains at 17% inflation. But here's the thing. We do know that during the tribulation, there is going to be a incredible inflation rate mingled with, or mixed, I should say, with a famine type conditions that's global in nature. We see the language there under the rider of the second horse, where we note that the rider of the third horse, of the black horse in the four horsemen of the apocalypse, has scales in his hand and says, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. Now, these are the grains of the rich, or the higher price grain, and the poor. Barley is the grain of the poor, 3 quarts of barley. Either way, however you slice it, it's basically the equivalent to a loaf of bread. Or I think the actual equivalent that's trying to be established there is one meal for one person. One meal for one person is going to cost a day's pay. And if the barley would feed 3 people, that's one meal for 3 people would cost a day's pay. Now, this is one meal for one day. And understanding this astronomical inflation rate, paired with what we just read with what's going on in Pakistan, that people are now being pushed toward violence against those in places of power who are controlling the prices of both energy related products and food staples, and people are getting tired of it. And one thing I'd like to draw attention to, we had the Great Depression back in the 1930s here in the United States and around the world. And if you look at pictures of the Depression era soup lines, you'll see people, men and women, standing in line very calmly, casually, dressed in the best that they had, or at least it was interesting that most men wore suits pretty much all the time. You'd see guys out, working a labor type of job, wearing a tie and having a hat on, and a fedora of some kind. And interesting watching what's happening today. Those soup lines wouldn't look like that. There would be more in line. They would be more in line with what we see in Pakistan. And this is part of that package that we see developing in the four horsemen of the apocalypse, where people are killing each other. Remember that the food supply will be so short that as we read the events that are taking place under the reign of terror, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that the animal kingdom begins to compete with humans for food, and even begins to view humans as a food source. And so here you've got people killing each other, which happens under the rider of the second horse. We're told that people will butcher one another. And the rider on the second horse is not talking about international warfare. It's talking about individual people killing each other. And, here's what we're being pushed to. There's talk, I think in many countries around the world, but here in the United States, there's talk of civil war. There's violence beginning to erupt at these pro-Palestinian marches, and people are being harassed for supporting Israel, and all these other things. And I had a conversation with a California Highway Patrolman the other day who was encouraging me. He said, "You as a pastor, you keep your eyes open, because they're coming after you guys." And we're hearing more and more events that pastors are being attacked or shot at, while they're in the pulpit. And, this is another age that we live in. And this points us back to what Jesus said about the days prior to his return. It will be as it was in the days of Noah. In Genesis, in the narrative there, we're told that the earth was filled with violence. So we would expect to see a very violent world prior to the coming of Christ for the church and us meeting him in the air. Now, here's another story, and I think most of you who've been with us for any length of time know I enjoy, examining this type of thing. And this comes from Watchers, a website we mention frequently, a weather website, a solar weather website, I should say. And the headline reads, and I think most of you have probably seen on social media, the incredible pictures way, way south of the Northern Lights, not just up in, the North Pole area, but now watching from Oregon and places far, far south throughout all of Canada, the Northern Lights from a major solar flare, coronal mass ejection, as more properly described. And this says a major X8, watcher says, a major X 8.7 flare erupts from the region of the sun known as region 3664. And it's the strongest flare of the solar cycle. And a powerful solar flare measuring X 8.7 erupted from this active region, currently located off the west limb of the sun at 1651 Greenwich Mean Time, the means by which all time in all countries is established, on May 14th, 2024. The event started at 1646 and ended at 1702, 24-hour clock, obviously. And this is the strongest solar flare of solar cycle 25 and the 16th X-class flare since May 1st. And today's X 8.7 is the strongest flare since X 9.3 on September 10th, 2017, the strongest solar flare of solar cycle 24. Now, the solar cycle is 11-year cycles. And interesting, watching these things happen, recognizing that during the tribulation, specifically in the bold judgments in Revelation chapter 16, we're told that the sun is given the power to scorch men's bodies. Now, this isn't that, the sun turns into a supernova or anything like that. That would incinerate the earth instantly. And that's not what we're talking about. I believe what the sun being given the power to scorch men's bodies is a solar flare, a coronal mass ejection so massive that it breaks down the Earth's protective magnetosphere and can no longer deflect the negatively charged ions that are coming from these CMEs and bombarding the Earth. And there was radio disruptions and things of that nature. But one thing I think we need to keep in mind is that, even though these are large in nature, they are very small in comparison to the largest CME ever recorded in known history, that is. There seems to be indication from ancient historians that there have been major coronal mass ejections in the past, but we didn't live in the electronic and technological age. They didn't live in it. I should say that we live in now. And there's an event called the Carrington Event in 1859, where there was the largest coronal mass ejection in recorded history that burned up telegraph lines and all that. And some stories of injuring and even killing telegraph operators by shocking them, sending the electronic current in reverse, and them having their hand on the telegraph machine and being killed, and all these other stories surrounding the Carrington Event of 1859 that lasted for a couple of days. Now, the interesting thing about this is think about the age in which we live. Can you imagine now? Let's pair our previous story or insertion, I should say, with that about the attitude of mankind today, the massive famine, the horrendous inflation. Imagine that a world where there's no moral boundaries, where lawlessness is abounding. People don't care. I mean, they don't even care these days for the life inside of a mother's womb. And so mankind has reached a place where they're willing to kill to protect their lifestyle. And, this is really what abortion is all about. It's not birth control. It's taking a human life inside of a mother's womb because you don't want to have to deal with raising a child. And, a lot of people like to make the argument, well, who would want to bring a child into this world? Well, the choice has already been made when extramarital sexual activity or premarital sexual activity is chosen. That's why one of the reasons I think God said, save it for marriage. When a couple can raise a family and shouldn't be single parents out there doing this, but we are where we are. But if you think about all of these things combined, could you imagine if there was no way to buy and sell food right now? In the world that we live in, the hatred that is already established and the animosity between even political groups. I mean, think about, the Trump supporters versus the Biden supporters, or the Republicans versus Democrats, and the language and the things we hear today, and the activities that we're watching unfold because someone is of a different political viewpoint, and how far we have fallen. Thinking back to the 60s, John F. Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon had taken a fall and broken his leg. And get this, John F. Kennedy suspended his campaign until Nixon was able to get back on his feet, quite literally, and began campaigning again because he deemed it unfair. Now, this is not what happens now. It's kick them while they're down. That's the political attitude of the day in which we live. But if you think about this, what if we had a Carrington type event today? One that disrupted all over the world telegraph systems. Imagine if gas pumps were not working, grocery stores were not operational, the doors wouldn't even open, cars wouldn't work. What would the world be like today? Would people be calmly standing in a bread line like we see pictures of from the 1930s, or would people be killing each other? I think we all know the answer to that, sadly. Now, here's the other thing. The tribulation doesn't last long enough for these types of attitudes to develop. And it happens quickly. Things happen in rapid succession. This is the first thing that the book of Revelation says, that, John was shown things that would happen shortly. And the word shortly means in quick succession once they begin. And so all these things, if you look at, the tribulation period and everything packed into Revelation 6 through 19, the number of catastrophic events that are going to take place have to be just almost riding right one on the back of the other. So the attitude to be willing to kill or see killed anyone who refuses to mark has to be brought into the tribulation, not developed during the tribulation. Are we there yet? Yeah, we're there. And I think if we see what happened in the Carrington event of 1859 happened during the tribulation, I think we know the end result. When food supply is short and expensive already, then we'll see what happens under the ride of the four horsemen, particularly the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, where death and Hades were riding with him, the one who's pale green in color. The Greek word there for the fourth horse is chloros, and it describes the color of a decaying corpse. That's what the word, obviously, it's the root of our word for chlorine. And if you want to know what that color looks like, think of someone who's been in a blonde-haired person in a swimming pool for many, many hours that has a lot of chlorine in it. Many of you will be familiar with that color, green, and that's the color of the fourth horse of the apocalypse. Now, here's a couple of stories to endorse what we've been saying. The Georgia Star says the New York court strikes down order banning transgender athletes. A judge has struck down a New York county's ban on transgender athletes from participating in female sports, saying the county executive exceeded his authority by issuing the directive. The ruling by State Supreme Court Judge Francis Riccoliano overturns an executive order signed by Nassau County Chief Executive Bruce Blakeman in February that requires any sports team seeking to use a county facility to provide information on the biological sex at birth of the team members' participants. Now, again, the unbelievable part of this is that it's happening at all, that this is even a discussion, and that you have to bring in proof of your biological sex at birth. I would think the person standing there would be the proof. But apparently this judge sees it as an extension of authority over this county chief executive. And the order allowed the county to deny permits to female sporting events with transgender participants. It didn't apply to male teams with transgender athletes. I don't know that I haven't seen any women who say they are men wanting to compete against biological men. I'm sure that cases happen, but I haven't heard of it. It's funny that it's always the other way around, where men want to say they are women and they compete against women who are smaller, have less muscle man, men are faster. And, I think it was Serena Williams who people said, there's not a man that could beat her, or, anybody that plays her in tennis. And the tennis match actually took place, and she was soundly defeated by a tennis player who on the ranking system was ranked at like number 400. And, this isn't a slight on women. We're different. And God made us that way. And we're supposed to be different. Men are supposed to be the protectors and, those who watch over their family. And that's why God made us bigger and stronger and faster. and all those other things. I mean, it's just ridiculous, the things that people are forcing on our young people today. And you know who's behind it. Who wants to disrupt the facts of God's creation and claim that, there's not just male or female, and this whole gender fluidity and all these other nonsensical things have just become rampant in these last days. And I think that tells us Jesus is going to come get us pretty soon. Now, Alpha News reports, and here's another story that I think is an escalation. Mother says that her daughter was attacked at school because she wasn't Muslim. And of course, I think our minds would all gravitate to where this happened, and that's in Minnesota. And this Minnesota mom is demanding answers after she says, now listen to this, her 9-year-old daughter was jumped on the school playground by a group of girls who she was told targeted her because she wasn't Muslim. And the reports about this disturbing details of the attack say that this took place on Monday, April 29th at Hidden Valley Elementary School in Savage, Minnesota. Larson said her daughter's third grade teacher and the principal approached her in the school pickup line after school to tell her what had happened. They came up to my vehicle and informed me that there was an incident at school that day. They wanted to make it very apparent that my daughter didn't do anything to cause this. And they told me this was a calculated incident and she had been attacked on the playground by 4 other 9-year-olds in her grade. I ended up learning that this was due to her race and her religion because she wasn't Muslim. So that was pretty jarring to hear, the mother said. Larson said she also was told by the teacher that the girls said this was why they decided to beat her up. It wasn't until the next day when her daughter started to bruise that Larson realized the severity of her injuries. That's when we noticed she had a black eye, and we immediately took a picture of it when she came home that day. I just kind of looked her over, and she had bruises on her arms and a bruise on her back and bruises all over her legs. And Larson's daughter told her that the girls pulled her down by her hair, started punching and kicking her. And she told me she tried to get up, and when she tried to get up and go for help the first time, and I believe it was the first time they had gotten her on the ground, that she was trying to fight back, and they told her that if she hit them or touched them, they would hurt themselves and tell the teacher that she had hurt them. So she just told me, so all I could do is just lay there, Mom. What a sad, sad story. This is a 9-year-old girl. And, contrary to, I've heard one of the most ridiculous things said by, again, a very well-known pastor here in Southern California, that there's no such thing as PTSD or anxiety attacks or any of those other things. And, this is going to have an impact on this girl. She's 9 years old. She got beat up because she wasn't a Muslim. And, I think so many people don't understand that, according to Islam, you are to offer the infidel one opportunity to convert. And that if not, you're free to take action. And, that's why the Quran says, take not for your friends or neighbors, Jews or Christians, for Allah guideth not an unjust people. And, people act like that's not in there, but it is in there. And, here we are seeing it on the playground at an elementary school. And this indoctrination is the same kind of indoctrination that we're seeing with Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip. Well, that's it for tonight's stories. And I hope you are encouraged and reminded that, this is what the Bible said it's going to be like in the last days. That perilous times would be upon us, and they are here without a doubt. And as I said at the outset, I believe that we are seeing an escalation, and there should be an escalation. If we're going to make that labor pain comparison that Jesus made in Matthew 24, 3-8, then we would expect to see an escalation. We would expect things to get more frequent and more intense. And we're watching that happen literally, I believe, on every prophetic front that relates to the ultimate fulfillment of these things during the tribulation. Inflation, I mean, think about these numbers, 300%, and just astronomical inflation rates. And I don't know if you caught that one portion out of that in the article about Argentina, but the interest rate was reduced from 50% to 40%. like 40% is going to help you. It's just incredible the things that we're seeing. Our country's in such debt, we'll never get out from underneath it. And if we default on that, that's going to have global ramifications. And obviously, all of this feeds into the tribulation period. And the world is turning against Israel. And we're seeing, the double speak, the double talk that's coming out of the administration here in the United States, the EU telling Israel this could have consequences. Of course, we know, what Iran and Russia and all these other nations that are going to be drawn down from the north and invade Israel, Turkey, Libya, and Sudan. We know that all of this is moving in that direction. And these are precursors, spokes on the wheel, the prophetic wheel, so to speak. And more things are coming into place that tells me, I believe, we need to be looking up because our redemption is nigh. Jesus is coming for us soon. We've not been appointed to wrath. Revelation 3:10, the church at Philadelphia has promised that they will escape the things that are coming upon the whole world to test men on the earth. And we have no appointment with any of those things. So we're not going to be taking mid-trib. We're not going to be taking post-trib. Post-trib rapture makes zero sense. I don't get that position at all. We have to be with Jesus to come back with Jesus already. So I don't think we're going to go up, sit at the Bema seat, then come back down in a couple of days, or even the 75-day span between the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the millennium. But anyway, I hope you are encouraged, even in the midst of all this ugliness. God is still on the throne. And it's interesting. We started the book of Nehemiah last Sunday, and I just want to encourage you, if you haven't listened, go to the YouTube channel if you're not watching it on that now, and listen to the message titled "Here Am I." And we found in our first study, and let me just give you a little teaser. The opening point was we don't have to be the majority for God to be in control. Nehemiah, one guy. Daniel, one guy. Joseph, one guy. Gideon, one guy. Moses, one guy. And all these people who stood up and basically just said, even reluctantly, like Gideon and Moses, here am I. Both men said, you might want to pick somebody else. But God still used these individuals. We don't have to have control, much like the Dominion theologist is errantly teaching, and stay away from that nonsense. Kingdom now theology, dominion theology, that the church has to have dominion over the 7 seats of power in order for Jesus to come back. That's baloney. Jesus said he's coming back when things are a mess, not when the church is in control. And we don't have to be in control or the majority for God to be in control. He is still on the throne. He is still in charge. He is still sovereign over the affairs of men. And Jesus is still coming again soon, I believe. So be encouraged. And by the way, we had last night, we had at church, every Wednesday night is just an open prayer time. But we've been having these targeted prayer times. And last night, it was a night of praise and thanksgiving. We had a wonderful time of worshiping the Lord, just one guitar and a cajon, and that's that box that a drummer will play. And we just had, unplugged worship. And then we had a time of people sharing. We've had a really major, intensified time of prayer of late at the church. And God has been saving people, healing people. And the things we heard last night, I was just so encouraged and blown away and excited to hear the things that God was doing. People with, one lady shared, she had a tumor was found in her lung that had spread to her cerebellum. And the tumor, after some time in her lung, seems to have disappeared. There's just a line, like a scar. It used to be there, but it's not there anymore. And the one in her cerebellum is shrinking. And what has been her treatment? Prayer. And just a multitude of things like that are happening. God answers prayer, and he is in control. So cry out to him. As Jeremiah 33:3 says, call to me and answer me. Call to me, and I will answer you and show you great and mighty things that you know not. God is in the miracle business, even yet today. He's still healing. He's still forgiving sin. He's still saving perishing souls. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, that's it for this week. So we'll see you next Tuesday, I hope. But what I do know for sure is we'll see you here, there, or in the air. God bless you.